We know his ending. That is the problem. Because we know how the story ends, because we know that Jesus turned to him and said, "Today you will be with me in paradise," we have spent 2,000 years reading that moment as a conclusion, as a destination, as the point the story was always building toward. We skipped everything that came before it. We skipped the morning he woke up in a Roman prison knowing it was his last day alive. We skipped the walk to Golgotha with the crossbeam on his shoulders and the crowd lining the streets. We skipped the nails. We skipped the hours on the cross before he said a single word to Jesus. We skipped the part where he was just a man dying. And in skipping all of that, we missed the most important question the story actually asks. Not what did Jesus say to him, but what happened inside him that made him say what he said. Because what the thief said to Jesus, the words that drew that extraordinary response, did not come from nowhere. They came from somewhere. From something he had seen or heard or felt in the hours between the nails and the conversation. And nobody asks what that was until now. We do not know his name. The gospel writers do not record it. Luke, who gives us the most detailed account of the exchange, simply calls him one of the criminals. The other gospel writers do not distinguish between the two men crucified alongside Jesus at all. They are background figures, part of the scene. Criminals executed alongside a preacher from Galilee on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem. But tradition gave him a name. The early Christian church, drawing on texts that circulated in the centuries after the Gospels, called him Dismas. The name appears in documents as early as the 4th and 5th centuries, and was widely accepted in both Eastern and Western Christian tradition. He was eventually venerated as a saint, Saint Dismas, the patron saint of prisoners, of those on death row, of people who feel they have gone too far to come back. His feast day in the Catholic tradition is March 25th. The man who had no name in the Gospels became the name that criminals prayed to in their darkest moments for 2,000 years. But before any of that, before the tradition and the veneration and the feast day, he was just a man on a cross who was running out of time. Let's start at the beginning of that day. Roman crucifixion did not begin at the cross. It began the night before, in a prison cell, when the sentence was confirmed and the condemned man understood that the morning would bring something he could not escape. The Romans were not careless about their executions. The process was deliberate. The condemned were held overnight, examined by soldiers to confirm identity and sentence, and prepared for public display. Dismas had almost certainly been in Roman custody for some time before that Friday. The charges against him, Luke uses the Greek word kakurgos, meaning evildoer or criminal, which in Roman legal context typically referred to serious crimes like robbery with violence, banditry, or insurrection, were not minor offenses that resulted in quick sentencing. They were the kind of charges that moved through the Roman legal apparatus over weeks or months. He had had time to think. Whatever his life had been, and we can only speculate about the choices and circumstances that had brought him to a Roman prison cell in Jerusalem, he had lived long enough with the consequences to understand them clearly. He was not a young man making his first mistake. He was a man at the end of a road he had chosen, staring at what that road had produced. The morning of the crucifixion began with flogging. Roman law permitted, and custom usually demanded, that condemned men be flogged before crucifixion. The instrument used was the flagrum, a short whip with multiple leather thongs, each tipped with lead balls or bone fragments. It was designed not merely to cause pain, but to systematically damage the body's surface, creating deep lacerations that bled heavily and weakened the victim before the cross. The purpose was not purely punitive. A severely weakened man died faster on the cross, and the Romans, for all their brutality, had a professional interest in managing the timeline of public executions. Crucifixion that lasted too many days created logistical complications and, occasionally, public sympathy. Dismas walked out of that flogging into the morning light of Jerusalem carrying a crossbeam that likely weighed between 75 and 100 pounds. His back was open, the wood pressed directly against the wounds, and he walked through the city to Golgotha while the population of Jerusalem, swollen with Passover pilgrims, crowded to a density the city rarely saw, lined the streets and watched. We know from Luke that there was a crowd following the procession. We know there were women weeping. Jesus spoke to them directly on the way, one of the last things he said before reaching the place of execution. We know the route passed through public areas. We know it was visible, deliberate, intended to communicate Roman power to as many people as possible. What did Dismas see on that walk? He saw a city that was not going to save him. He saw the faces of people who had turned out to watch him die, some in horror, some in curiosity, some with the particular detachment of crowds that have seen too many executions to feel them individually anymore. He saw Roman soldiers managing the procession with the efficiency of men doing a job. He saw the gates of the city receding behind him as the road led outward toward the skull-shaped hill where the crosses waited. And beside him, he saw Jesus. This is a detail that almost never gets the attention it deserves. Dismas walked to his death next to Jesus. They were close enough to hear each other breathe, close enough to see each other's faces when the procession slowed or stopped, close enough that the conversation they would eventually have on the cross was not between strangers who had never been in proximity before. They had made the same walk. They had arrived at the same place. The nailing took only minutes. The Romans had perfected the mechanics of crucifixion over centuries. The condemned was laid on the ground with the crossbeam beneath his shoulders. The nails, iron spikes typically 7 to 9 inches long, were driven through the wrists, between the radius and ulna, where the bone structure could support the weight of the body without tearing through. Then the upright beam. Then the feet, crossed and pinned with a single nail through the heel bones. Then the cross was raised, and the waiting began. Death by crucifixion is death by slow suffocation. The position of the body, arms extended, weight hanging, makes it progressively harder to breathe. The only way to draw a full breath is to push up against the nail through the feet, straightening the body enough to expand the chest. Every breath requires an act of will against the pain in the feet and wrists. Every breath, for hours, sometimes days, is a choice. Dismas made that choice repeatedly in the hours between the nailing and the conversation. He breathed. He endured. He listened. And what he heard changed everything. Because the cross of Jesus was not silent. From the moment they were raised, the crowd gathered at Golgotha was vocal. The chief priests and the scribes who had orchestrated the arrest and the night trial came to watch. They did not watch quietly. Matthew records them mocking Jesus openly. "He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross and we will believe in him." They were quoting his own words back at him as mockery. The claims Jesus had made about his identity, his authority, his relationship with God, all of it was being used as the punchline of a joke at the foot of his own execution. The soldiers joined in. Luke records that they offered him sour wine and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." The sign Pilate had ordered placed above the cross read, "This is the King of the Jews," in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so that every person in Jerusalem during Passover week could read it in their native tongue. Dismas heard all of it. He was close enough that the mockery directed at Jesus was also landing on him. The contempt of the crowd, the voices of the religious leaders, the professional indifference of the soldiers, all of it was the soundtrack of his dying. And Luke records that initially, the other criminal, the one tradition calls Gestas, joined in the mockery. Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. Luke does not tell us that Dismas joined in. He does not tell us that Dismas was silent either. But something was happening inside him that was moving in the opposite direction from the crowd. If you have never heard this story told from the inside, from the lived human experience of the people who were actually there, subscribe right now. Every week, we go deeper than the surface of Scripture into the real cost and the real courage of the people who lived these moments. At some point in those hours, we do not know exactly when, Dismas heard something else. Luke records that as Jesus was being nailed to the cross, in the midst of the process itself, in the middle of the pain of the nailing, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." A man being nailed to a cross, asking forgiveness for the people doing it. Dismas heard that. He was close enough to hear it, and something about those words, or the accumulation of everything he had seen and heard from the moment he first encountered Jesus that morning, began to work on him in a way that the hours on the cross only deepened. Because here is what Dismas had by the time he finally spoke. He had seen Jesus walk to his own death with a bearing that no man he had ever known had walked toward death. He had heard Jesus pray for his killers while they were still killing him. He had listened to the mockery of the crowd and the religious leaders and understood, in the way that dying men sometimes understand things with sudden clarity, that the mockery was wrong, that the people doing it did not understand what they were looking at, that he understood it, somehow, from a cross, in his final hours. And when the other criminal turned on Jesus and demanded rescue, Dismas rebuked him. "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." 3 sentences. In 3 sentences, a dying criminal did what the Sanhedrin could not do, what Pilate had tried to do and failed, what the crowd was actively refusing to do. He told the truth. We deserve this. He does not. Then he turned to Jesus, not to demand rescue, not to bargain, not to offer a transaction. He made a request so modest, so stripped of expectation, that it has stopped readers cold for 2,000 years. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Remember me. Not save me now. Not bring me down from this cross. Not give me another chance at a different life. Just remember me when you get where you're going. Whenever that is, however that works. Just don't forget that I was here. It is the prayer of a man who expects nothing and asks for the smallest possible thing. And the response he received was the largest possible thing. Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Today, not someday, not eventually, not after a period of waiting or purification or proof. Today, the man who had spent his life taking things, who had arrived at that cross as a consequence of taking, received in his final hours the one thing that no amount of taking could ever produce. He had not earned it. He had not deserved it. He had not had time to demonstrate changed behavior or make restitution or build a track record of better choices. He had simply told the truth and asked to be remembered. And that was enough. There is a theological argument that has circled this story for centuries. Some have called it dangerous. The thief on the cross, they argue, creates a loophole, a precedent that suggests a person can live however they wish, say the right words at the last possible moment, and receive the same outcome as someone who spent a lifetime in faithful service. It is a reasonable concern, but it misreads the story at its most important point. Dismas did not say the right words. He said the true words. There is a difference. He was not performing a formula. He was not executing a strategy. He was not working the system one final time, with the same calculating intelligence that had presumably served him well in his life of crime. He was a man at the absolute end of everything, with nothing left to offer and nothing left to lose, looking at the person next to him and telling the truth about what he saw. That is not a loophole. That is the point. The entire Gospel of Luke builds toward this moment precisely because Luke is making an argument about who Jesus came for. Not for the people who had it together, not for the religious professionals who had spent decades maintaining their standing in the system, not for the people who deserved it by any measurable standard. For this man, nails through his wrists, blood on the wood, hours left to live, and a request so small it barely counted as a request. The tradition around Dismas preserves one more detail that is worth holding. His death came before Jesus's. John records that the soldiers came to break the legs of the crucified men, standard Roman procedure to accelerate death when time was running short before the Sabbath, and that when they came to Jesus, they found him already dead and did not break his legs. But they broke the legs of the men crucified on either side of him. Dismas died with broken legs, shortly before Jesus did. He was already gone when the centurion made his declaration. He did not hear it. He did not need to. He had already gone where Jesus told him he would go. Today. There is something about the thief on the cross that every person who has ever felt too far gone needs to hear directly. He did not clean himself up before he came to Jesus.
He could not. He was on a cross.
There was nothing to clean up, and no way to clean it even if there had been. He came exactly as he was, criminal record intact, Roman nails through his wrists, the consequence of every bad decision he had ever made written into the sentence above his head. And he was received, not despite where he was, not in spite of what he had done, in the middle of it, at the bottom of it, at the precise moment when there was nothing left of him worth receiving by any human standard. He was received. That is either the most reckless thing in the entire New Testament, or it is the most honest thing. 2,000 years later, people still pray to St. Dismas in prison cells. Not because he lived a good life, not because he left a legacy of virtue or built anything that lasted, not because he suffered more bravely than other men, or demonstrated unusual courage, or produced fruit that the church could point to. Because he told the truth at the worst possible moment.
And because the answer he received in that moment is the answer that every human being who has ever reached the end of their own resources needs to know is available. Not someday. Today. Before you leave, I want to ask you one question. Is there something in your life, something in your past, something in who you have been, that you have convinced yourself puts you beyond the reach of what happened on that cross? Because Dismas had the same thought. The evidence suggests he came to a different conclusion. Write in the comments what this story means to you personally. Not theologically, personally. I read every single one, and I have found that the responses to this particular story are unlike any other, because this particular story touches something that most people carry in silence. You do not have to carry it in silence here.